Welcome to Generals of World War II, The Art of Command. I am your host, John Viscardo, and with me once again is the fabulous, brilliant Trent Hone. Hello, Trent.
Hello, John. You compliment me. I appreciate it.
I like to work on my superlatives for you. Those are the first two that came to mind. But Trent
Thank
is
you.
an author. He's got a number of books out, Nimitz, Learning War, and then he's working on one right now, which is the subject matter of today's podcast, which is Admiral King. Can you tell us about this upcoming book?
Sure. Yeah, this is going to be a look at leadership and command opportunities that Admiral King had throughout his career. And it's going to explore the question of how did he rise to the highest command positions that the U.S. Navy offered, and then lead from those positions in the Second World War.
Like we were talking before we came on, I don't know a lot about Admiral King, so this will be an informative podcast for me as well. So I'm excited to get into it. Please check out Trent's books anywhere books are sold, or Amazon.
Yeah, Amazon's good, but especially the Naval Institute, they're the publisher. So their website often offers discounts. Naval Institute Press, if you just search for that, usni.org.
Okay, so check out Trent's books there as well. All right, let's talk about this Admiral King. He was born in Lorain, Ohio, in 1878 and grew up far from the coast he would one day command. How did his Midwestern upbringing kind of shape his early outlook on naval service?
Well, I think this is actually very important for him because one of the things that King gets into, his father was an engineer who built bridges, but then got into work in the rail yards. So the railroads are up and coming in this time in the late 19th century, very important industrial element of the United States. And Lorain is a coastal city. So it's got a railroad nexus. It's also a port for shipments across the Great Lakes. So as the United States is increasing in its industrial capacity in the late 19th century, King is going to school. He starts working with his father in the rail yards. And so he learns about steam and he learns about engineering. And these are talents that the Navy wants in this time period as they start adopting more steam power and investing more in modern steel ships. King comes into the Navy at a very opportune time, given his background and his education before coming to the Naval Academy.
So he's around that kind of industrial age, that tinkering, that mechanical ability that you want, I guess, in a naval officer.
Yeah, that you want in this time. And it's important to remember, we call that part of the world the Rust Belt today, but this is before it rusted. This is when it was still forming.
Yeah, that was cutting edge technology. I did an episode recently on Yamamoto, and he toured that area, and I think he was kind of overawed by how much industrial strength was there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, King graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1901, finishing near the top of his class. What aspects of King's performance at the Naval Academy do you think foreshadowed his success?
Oh, King has an interesting career at the Naval Academy. He performs very well in the kind of educational system that they have there. There's a lot of rote memorization. He's got a good mind for that. So pretty quickly he was like, okay, I can do this. I can master this. But one of the things that he begins to develop is today, I think we'd call it a chip on his shoulder, because he comes from this blue collar background. And a lot of, or a greater percentage of Naval Academy attendees at that point, cadets, because they called them cadets when King entered. The midterm midshipman wasn't in use yet. They are more from like a white collar background. And so he's kind of like, okay, you all think you're better than me because your background is better. I'll show you. I'll show you with my intellectual skill. I'll show you with my leadership capability, because he becomes one of the leaders of the cadets, which showcases another thing that he was good at. He could win the trust of the cadets, but he also could become a recognized leader by virtue of the Academy's administration. So he positions himself very well and displays some political acumen, maneuvering himself into a leadership position before graduation.
All right, well, let's talk about his first assignments. He serves in the Spanish-American War, gaining exposure to combat. How did his early wartime experiences kind of influence his approach to leadership?
Well, I think that's really interesting because the Spanish-American War happens in 1898, and he enters the Naval Academy, like a year before, and so he and other cadets dash out to try to find service in the fleet because one of the ways to get promoted more rapidly is meritorious wartime service. So they're like, let's leave the academy. Let's go find service in the fleet. And he gets service on a cruiser that is cruising up and down sort of the northern reaches of the East Coast. It's not really doing anything important. It's guarding the coast from, a potential Spanish threat. But eventually, it does go down toward Cuba off of Havana, and there is a threat that, perhaps the Spanish ships there are going to sortie. So the cruiser starts approaching the port, and the Spanish shore batteries open fire. They get the range of the ship. It's not hit, but there is a near miss, sends some splinters through the aft portion of the ship. And King, watches all this happen. But it's funny because his classmates sort of tease him about his Spanish-American War service. There's a note in the Lucky Bag, which is the yearbook of the Naval Academy from his graduation, that talks about how he won fame, sort of off the coast of New England in the Spanish-American War. Basically, like, yeah, you went to sea, but you didn't really do anything. He did get shot at, but wasn't injured. I think the most important anecdote from his career in that time, at least as he remembered it, was he had to go to shore periodically for provisions. And he would take a small boat to do that, often with a small crew in that boat. And he wasn't the best at handling the boat. He had trouble getting it to dock appropriately. And there was an old coxswain in the aft of the ship, that little boat, who, after King had messed up a couple times, was like, "Hey, Mr. King, I think I can help you." And he did. And so that taught King that, hey, some of these enlisted sailors, they're older than I am. They have knowledge I don't have. And I have to figure out how to leverage that in order to be an effective leader.
Yeah, I think that's a great point for any officer. Is like, you not only do you learn from, the officers above you, you can also learn from the enlisted men below your rank and become a better officer that way.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
Let's talk about World War One. He's assigned to the staff. Is it Admiral Mayo? Is that right?
Yep. Admiral Mayo.
And he's commander in chief of the Atlantic Fleet. So how did this assignment kind of build his strategic and administrative skills? Is this like he's an aide de camp type of role?
Well, sort of, yeah. He was assistant chief of staff and then served as the acting chief of staff when the chief of staff was injured in France as a roadway accident. So this is a really important role for King. He had been on staffs earlier. He had found a mentor in an officer named Hugo Osterhaus. And so King's first time on staffs was with Osterhaus, and King knew how to be part of that activity. But with Mayo, King really looks at him, talks about this later in his career, as an exemplar of the kind of leadership that King wanted to embrace. A few things that he pointed out about Mayo's approach. Mayo was very good at basically saying, here, subordinates, this is what I want you to do, but I'm not going to tell you the details. I'm not going to get into that. I'll tell you what, you figure out how. And King helped him do that, helped craft plans and orders for the Atlantic Fleet that allowed Mayo to exercise command that way. So that was good from King's perspective. The other thing that's important about King's World War I service on the staff of Admiral Mayo is he learns how an ineffective civilian military dialogue can inhibit strategy. So Mayo assumes once the United States enters the war, well, I'm commander-in-chief of the Atlantic Fleet. I should be, commanding all the ships, at least in the Atlantic, and ensuring that our nation's military force, naval forces anyway, are used to further the political aims that we have within this war. But the Secretary of the Navy, Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, doesn't want to work that way. It's like, no, I am the civilian authority. And here in the United States, civilian authority is paramount. So, Mayo, you have to operate the way I want you to. There's a new organization in the Navy at the time, the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. It came about in 1915. Daniels has picked a guy named William Benson, and he is the Chief of Naval Operations. Now, Daniels very deliberately picked somebody who was relatively junior and elevated them to this position, in part so that he could maintain control of the Navy. And so he manages the Navy more or less himself, Daniels and Benson. And one of the things that they do is they set up Admiral William Sims, in Europe to kind of operate as a peer to Mayo. Nominally on the org chart, Sims reports to Mayo. But in terms of how Benson and Daniels run the war, Sims is more or less a peer. And in order to fight German U-boats, they start sending destroyers from Mayo's fleet to Sims which limits the maneuverability and the influence that Mayo has. And so there's this frustration that Mayo develops and his staff. So King inherits part of this. Hey, we're not being used strategically. We're not furthering the nation's ends. We're just kind of being a force provider to the fighting that is happening in Europe. And we're ensuring the safe travel of the American Expeditionary Force to France. We're not doing much else. And that frustrates King and that frustrates Mayo. And so he gets in his head, King does, well, if we ever have to do this again, we've got to make sure that we've got clearer lines of authority so that the nation can more effectively use its naval power to achieve political ends. And so he takes that into his career in the 20s and 1930s, and I think has that in the back of his mind when World War II breaks out.
Funny, he had that foresight that if we have to do this again, say in 1941, it'd be good that we have this in place and a system in place where we don't have too many chefs in the kitchen, I guess.
Yeah. There aren't too many chefs in the kitchen, and there's a better dialogue across that civil military boundary.
Well, in the 1920s, King becomes a pioneer in submarine operations and helps shape early U.S. submarine doctrine. What role did he play in the evolution of America's submarine force?
King commands a couple submarine divisions and assumes control of a submarine command there on the North Atlantic, and he does a couple of things. One, he insists that the sailors have to get used to being on the submarines. Like, submarines at this era are the early 1920s. They're not very big. They're small. It's unpleasant to stay on them. The terminology used at the time is pig boat because they smell bad, evocative of a pigsty. But he encourages them to get accustomed to this, to being able to, operate from their little boats, stay on their little boats, increase their capability and endurance. And he also introduces divisional tactics, right? So don't just operate submarines individually, operate them as a coordinated team. Yeah. This doesn't go terribly far, right? Because it's very difficult to coordinate submarines at this period. But the vision of using them in mass is sort of an early precursor to the wolf pack tactics that the Germans are ultimately going to introduce in World War II.
I was just going to ask you about that. If he picked up, one, the importance of submarines from the Germans, and two, the Wolfpack system.
So this is more of, King bringing his concepts and ideas because he had served in destroyers before joining Admiral Mayo's staff, and he had learned what a coordinated destroyer attack could do. And at this point, submarines are more like submersible torpedo boats than anything else. And so I think he's conceiving of them that way. Like, if we are able to employ the kinds of doctrine and techniques that the destroyers did, we can be more effective because we can coordinate an attack in mass, or at least larger mass than just an individual ship. And I think that primes him to recognize what the Germans start doing in World War II with true Wolfpack tactics, and not only to recognize the threat that presents, but also one of the things that he does later in World War II is to tell the Pacific Fleet submarines, the U.S. Pacific Fleet submarines, adopt similar tactics, like do wolf packs, don't just attack individually. Right. And they start doing that later in the war to great effect.
Well, he also becomes a strong advocate for naval aviation, earning his wings in 1927, a la Halsey and even Yamamoto, who knew the importance of aircraft before anyone else did. Why was King's support of aviation significant for the Navy's modernization?
There's a couple of factors at work here. One is King chooses aviation, I think, in large part because it's a pathway to faster advancement. In the mid-1920s, he's a captain, and his next command ought to be a cruiser. But the cruiser commands that are coming available, they're going to more senior officers. So he's like, I need a command. I'm not senior enough to get one of the cruisers. What can I do? And Congress had passed a law just in 1926, if I remember right, that to command a Navy aviation command, so like an aircraft carrier or a seaplane tender or a naval air station, you had to be an aviator. Now you could be a real aviator, a pilot, or you could be an observer. So King was like, if I commit to naval aviation, I can get a command. I can get a decent command that will raise my visibility. So he does. He gets command of a seaplane tender and then goes to flight training in Pensacola. Now, he takes an accelerated flight training. He doesn't take the thing that the younger pilots are going through, but he actually does become a pilot, not just an observer. And there are some anecdotes from his time there where, there are maneuvers you have to do. There are certain acrobatics that were part of the training program, and they were willing to let him not do the acrobatics. And he was like, well, forget that. Bring it on. I'm going to do it. He wasn't the best pilot, but he was able to do the acrobatics. He was able to pass the course and then got into aviation. So not just commanding the seaplane tender, but then also becoming one of the commanding officers of carrier Lexington, which is one of the two battle cruisers that are converted under the auspices of the Washington Treaty. And they're the first real, Langley is the United States Navy's first carrier, but it's small and experimental and not very capable. Lexington and Saratoga are really capable ships. And so in the fleet problems, King is commanding Lexington and using it as his vehicle to illustrate, like he did at the Naval Academy, I'm good at this. You are going to accept my competence because I'll show you how good I am. And he does that repeatedly in a couple of the fleet problems.
It sounds like we take for granted, but submarines and airplanes were new technologies at the time. And it sounds like he was willing to learn new things and new tactics to help maybe advance his career and advance the Navy.
Yeah, absolutely. You see this synergy, sort of this dovetailing. Like there's no way you can't sort of look at him and see him as a driven individual who's like, I am going to advance. I'm going to try to reach the Navy's highest ranks, and I'm going to prove my competency. But through that, he helps the Navy get better, improves carrier aviation techniques and tactics. One of the things that he introduced on Lexington was the idea of a combat air patrol. That is fighters that are going to loiter over the aircraft carrier to intercept any attacking bombers to decrease vulnerability. That was a new tactic, and it was something he introduced.
Yeah, it's like sentries kind of outposted from your army, like keep an eye on everything. Well, you mentioned the Lexington, which he commanded. What were his major staff roles in the interwar period? I know he was chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics.
Right. Yeah. So after commanding Lexington, he goes to the Naval War College as part of the senior course. This is where he writes a very interesting thesis that talks about civil-military relations and their importance, sort of building on the experience that I alluded to from World War I. And then the Bureau of Aeronautics, Admiral Moffett, he's been the head since it was introduced. 1921. He's got his vision for how naval aviation is going to progress. Well, he's killed. One of the Navy's airships crashes, and that kills Admiral Moffett. And so now there's an opportunity. Who is going to command the Bureau of Aeronautics? And it's kind of fascinating because there is jockeying in Washington, and King goes to Washington, leaves the Naval War College in the middle of an exercise. Like, I'm going to Washington. I'm going to do my best to secure this opportunity to become head of the Bureau of Aviation, or Bureau of Aeronautics. And he had to compete with a guy named John Towers, a captain who was Moffett's choice to be the next BU Air Chief. But King is able to outmaneuver Moffett, make a better case to the Secretary of the Navy and other senior officers. And so he becomes head of the Bureau of Aeronautics and champions patrol aircraft, or patrol bombers, really, which are a way for the Navy to increase its fighting strength within the limits of the Washington Naval Treaty, right? You can only build so many battleships, you can only build so many aircraft carriers, but there's no limit on, how many of these patrol bombers you can build. And so the PBY Catalina, that does so much sterling service in World War II, is acquired during King's time as head of the Bureau of Aeronautics. Another famous plane, or more infamous plane, that is acquired during that time is the TBD Devastator, the torpedo bomber that did not fare well at Midway, just because it was good when it was procured in the mid-1930s. By 1942, it had advanced beyond its capability. So King, but crucial thing that he does that I want to mention also, there is a legal limit when King becomes head of the Bureau of Aeronautics in terms of how many aircraft the Navy can have. It's been capped by law. And so he works with Congress through his congressional testimony and other activities to introduce new legislation that basically says, we're going to keep naval aviation of a size that is commensurate with the size of the fleet. So as the fleet gets bigger, aviation could get bigger.
Right.
And that was crucial in the run up to World War II.
Well, it sounds like most of the really great top brass leaders from this time know how to play the politics game. It sounds like King knows how to politic himself efficiently.
He learns more of that during this time because he's there in Washington. He's testifying to Congress. He's got to work with other bureau chiefs, like the chief of Bureau of Navigation, who controls personnel, Bureau of Construction and Repair, Bureau of Ordnance. So they work together under the guidance of the Navy Secretary. And so King starts to learn how that maneuvering happens, how to secure the right kind of position. And I think he becomes more visible to the new president, Franklin Roosevelt, who is interested in, he wants to get the United States out of the Depression first, but he's also interested, as war clouds start to gather over Europe, in positioning the United States to help support the democracies.
Let's get into World War II now. 1941, after Pearl Harbor, King becomes commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet, gaining sweeping authority over naval operations. What challenges did King face when assuming command in the disastrous aftermath of Pearl Harbor?
Well, he's got a new command. I mean, yes, there had been a commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet previous to that. So in a sense, he's inheriting that. But King's headquarters is going to be in Washington. Again, reflecting the World War I experience, he doesn't want to be out. He doesn't want to be in the Pacific or in the Atlantic. He wants to be where the seat of power is. So he's got to build a new staff and a new headquarters in Washington. And he borrows some from the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, because the two of them have to work together. The Chief of Naval Operations at this time is Admiral Harold Stark. And so King and Stark have to develop an effective working relationship. They have to figure out how their staffs are going to work together. That's a big challenge. But King's attention is very much drawn to the Pacific, right? Because the Japanese have done things that are completely unanticipated. The strike on Pearl Harbor, and then they tear through the Far East. They isolate the Philippines. They capture Singapore. They start to threaten Australia. And one of the things that I think is very interesting is King begins to recognize how crucial it is to stop that, to sort of bring together enough coherence to disrupt the Japanese offensive. The thing he becomes very concerned about is Australia and whether or not it's going to be isolated. So his first order to Nimitz, after the two of them are now in their new jobs, at the end of December 1941, King tells Nimitz basically, protect Hawaii. That's priority one. Priority two, and only slightly less important, is ensure the sanctity of the lines of communication between the U.S. West Coast and Australia. King forms, with the agreement of the other members of the Joint Chiefs and the Combined Chiefs, a new area. It's called the Anzac area, Australia and New Zealand. And originally that was supposed to be an Australian command, but they don't have the ships and they don't have the fighting strength at that time because their army divisions are all overseas. Some of them are fighting their way back to Australia. But they were fighting for the British in North Africa. And King basically assumes command of this Anzac area himself, takes one of Nimitz's carriers, and starts urging his subordinates to thwart the Japanese advance. And they do enough to ensure that U.S. forces can make it to Australia, begin to use it as a base, and occupy the island of New Caledonia, which is a vital portion there off the northeastern corner of Australia.
All very interesting, but it's more interesting because in 1942, he becomes Chief of Naval Operations, the only man in U.S. history to have both, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. fleet and Chief of Naval Operations. So I guess what advantages and risks came with King holding both of these positions at once?
Well, I mentioned that he has to work with Admiral Stark, who was Chief of Naval Operations.
Was, right.
But there's friction there, right? So as they're reinforcing islands like, Samoa and Fiji and others on the line of communication between the U.S. and Australia, there are so many groups that have to be coordinated, right? King has to coordinate with Stark. The two of them have to coordinate with General Marshall, who's the Chief of Staff of the Army. They have to make sure that they can secure shipping. And there's confusion, or lack of clarity, I should say, between what is King's role and what is Stark's role. And where I think that is really exposed is in the German attack on the East Coast. The U-boats, move from the Atlantic to the eastern seaboard, particularly like off Cape Hatteras and other places. And that, I don't think the Germans understood they were doing this, but they're striking at a fissure in the U.S. command structure because King is Comanche, so he controls the Navy's operating forces. Stark is the CNO, and so he does a lot about like force allocation, and also the naval district commandants and the naval frontier commanders report up to him. So King and Stark and their subordinates are sort of caught in this mess of like they can point fingers at each other, and they do to a certain extent. Like who's got the ball to fight these German U-boats? Who's responsible for ensuring we do convoys on the East Coast? And it's a mess, and the Germans sink a lot of ships, and so that confusion has to get mitigated. And so Roosevelt and King, I mean, because King is pushing on Roosevelt, basically be like, look, there's got to be one guy in charge. You've got to have a single throat that you can choke to make sure that the Navy's doing everything that it should do. It should be me.
Well, yeah, like we were talking earlier, too many chefs in the kitchen.
Exactly. And so King becomes Commensch and CNO. And one of the first things he does is tell the subordinate commands on the East Coast, like, you're putting convoys together because this is the way. I mean, it doesn't defeat U-boats, but it makes it harder for them to sink ships. So eventually those come into play. And he then, asserts a great deal of authority across the Navy, not just in terms of directing the operational maneuvers of ships and task forces, but also through procurement and sustainment of those forces. Fortunately, he's got a very capable subordinate, a guy named Vice Admiral Horne becomes the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, which is a new role introduced by the executive order that makes King CNO and Commensch. And Horne does a lot to run the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations for King, so King can stay focused on operations. But of course, he looks over Horne's shoulder periodically as well to make sure he's doing everything he needs to do.
Yeah. Well, another thing that I often hear about, and anytime you see a history documentary on the strategy, you always hear, well, it was Germany first was the strategy, but King also insisted on maintaining strong forces in the Pacific. So how did he kind of balance between the Atlantic and Pacific theaters?
King insists on getting after the Japanese. So not only the Anzac area, but that South Pacific line of communication with Australia is a focus, right? That helps trigger the Battle of the Coral Sea. Midway is somewhat secondary, but Midway results in this significant victory, right? Gives the opportunity for an offensive. And King had already been working on plans for an offensive in the South Pacific, move northwestward through the Solomon Islands toward Rabaul. He shared a plan that outlined that with Admiral Nimitz in April 1942. And so after Midway, it's like, well, here's the plan. Here's what we're going to do. And very quickly, he tells Nimitz to do that. I think it's in late June. He's like, here, we're going to execute this offensive operation. You're going to seize Tulagi, which is, of course, across the Sound from Guadalcanal. And then he retroactively goes back to Admiral Marshall and the other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and is like, hey, we're doing this. So get on board. General MacArthur, who is in Australia, has an alternative plan. It's like he wants to seize the same objective. And so Marshall and King have this back and forth, like, how do we reconcile these things? Eventually, they figure out a way to do it. They compromise. The Navy will lead the first part of the offensive, and then command will shift to MacArthur. But that draws forces. And I think King he doesn't disagree with Germany first in terms of Germany should be the priority because, Germany has greater industrial capacity than Japan. Makes sense to allocate more of the U.S. fighting strength to the European theater. What he disagrees with is the idea that we're going to just hold in the Pacific, wait until Germany's done, and then we're going to go after the Japanese. He thinks from a very early moment that the United States has sufficient industrial capacity to fight in offensives in both theaters, and that it's crucial to keep the pressure on the Japanese, not only to resist them, but to push them back. He's constantly arguing for that sort of perspective in Joint Chiefs of Staff meetings and Combined Chiefs of Staff meetings. And it earns him a reputation of being very abrasive and very, Pacific oriented.
Yeah, that term Germany first, yes, we did defeat Germany first, the Allies did, but it's also something we promised Churchill, but it's not like we didn't send assets to the Pacific to, like you said, just maintain a defensive line. We were attacking over there as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And King thinks that South Pacific offensive is way to sort of draw resources. I mean, I haven't encountered any official document that makes that explicit, but it seems to be his implicit sense because so after he and Marshall agree that they're going to conduct this offensive in the South Pacific, That's early July 1942. A couple days later, they get a message from the British, and the British are starting to get cold feet about assaulting the European continent, basically doing what would become Operation Overlord. Marshall wanted to do that in 1943. And the British are kind of saying, I'm not sure we're going to be able to do that. Now, they have good reasons. They're very hard pressed in North Africa. The war is not going the way they assumed it would. So they're thinking, let's do an African operation, what becomes Operation Torch. Marshall thinks they're trying to, they're going back on their word. They're trying to revise strategy. So he grabs some of King's thoughts. It's like, we're going to tell the British, we're going to the Pacific. That's all we're going to do. And they tell President Roosevelt this. They send him a note while he's in Hyde Park. And Roosevelt, it calls them. It's like, we're not even going to exchange messages here. I'm going to call you and basically tell you, you are not doing this. We're going to try to alter the historical records so it never looks like we were going to sell the British out.
Right. Well, I guess my biggest question is, under his leadership, the U.S. Navy achieved decisive victories, expanded massively, and became the world's dominant force. What were King's most important strategic contributions to the Allied victory? And I say this because, is he as important, more important, less important than, say, Nimitz or Halsey, who are on the front lines, in your opinion?
That's a good question. I would struggle to assign levels of importance, but I think he's crucially important. He can do things that Nimitz can't do. Now, the inverse is also true, right? So one of the things that Nimitz and King have a lot of conferences during the war. And one of the things they always talk about is senior officers. Who are the best? Who should we be giving like carrier task group command opportunities to, or cruiser division command opportunities to? And Nimitz knows that better than King. Nimitz is a better people person. He's better at identifying talent. But King is a better political maneuverer. He's better for Washington. He is the person who can, when necessary, go toe-to-toe with General Arnold, who's trying to argue for an independent Air Force, and the British service chiefs. That's a thing that makes King very important. He ensures that the Pacific is not forgotten. He ensures that the Pacific is driven, because the combined chiefs adopt a unremitting pressure on the Japanese eventually over the course of 1943. I don't think that they would have agreed to that unless King had continued to insist on it. And that perspective is really important because another angle on it. So Admiral Leahy eventually joins the Joint Chief of Staff to President Roosevelt, helps balance them out a little bit, right? Because although he is a naval officer, he very much operates from the perspective of the president. One of his staff members recalled a conversation with him where Leahy basically said, there are times when King really gets after the British, but I'm so glad that he does, because when he does that, that means I don't have to do it. I can remain the conciliatory person who brings us all together, who ensures that we're unified. So I've told this to a number of other people, particularly, current officers, and they're like, yeah, sometimes you need the guy who's going to come in the room and throw the hand grenade so that you can get it on the table.
Yeah, good cop, bad cop. You need that.
Exactly. And so when you're asking, what are some of the most important things that King does, I think that's one of the most important things that he does. He makes sure that the U.S. and British service chiefs get it on the table so that they can work it out. And in their memoirs, they complain about him. But at the end of the war, they give him some very touching, personal accolades. We're so glad you served with us. And
he got things done. He cut through red tape. He, made sure Nimitz and Halsey and the rest were able to do their job. So, I think you should give plenty of credit.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, he retires in 1945 as a fleet admiral and remains influential as an advisor and writer until his death in 1956. So, final question, what is the legacy of Admiral King?
Well, I think it's not perceived well enough sometimes, I think, but I think he's really crucial to how the Navy decides and then fights. So he's there, what I'll call kind of at the beginning. A guy named Dudley Knox gets an awful lot of credit for introducing Navy doctrine. He wrote an article in the Naval Institute's Proceedings back in 1915, if I remember right, called The Role of Doctrine in Naval Warfare. Now, he built up to that. Knox did. He started publishing his first thoughts on that some years before. But Knox is often cited as a very influential officer who was part of the torpedo flotilla under Captain Sims, who developed doctrine as the U.S. Navy knew it. Well, King was part of that group also. He commanded a destroyer. He was part of King Sims's staff for a little while. So King is part of that mix, and he embraced the same kind of idea, which is, we've got to have a shared mental model for how we're going to fight, and that then allows you to command with intent, basically say what you want to accomplish, and then allow the details to flow down or to be executed by your subordinates. He embraces that before the U.S. entry into World War I, continues it through, and is a driving force to execute that in submarines, in aircraft, and then at the Navy's highest rank in World War II. And so I think that's crucial. He sort of is the catalyst for the Navy embracing this, or capitalizing on, not just embracing, this very aggressive mindset that serves it so well through World War II.
And it kind of dovetails on what you started out with. I'm going to tell you what to do. You guys figure out how to do it.
Yep.
I want to be cutting edge in aviation. I want to be cutting edge in submarine warfare. You figure out how to do it, but that's what I want.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting in the memoirs is you get people responding to King differently. Some are very much like, yeah, he was tough, but I loved it. Right. And I understand that, because what you can see is he holds people accountable. Like, you've got to be able to perform. And if you can perform, and if you know your stuff, he seems to have been someone that was decent to work for. But if he didn't think you could cut it,
yeah,
it sounded like he was a terror.
But, the soldiers and sailors respect that. We want a guy who knows what he's doing, whether he's hard on us or not. And same thing with the Duke of Wellington in the Napoleonic times. Like, he wasn't the gentlest, fluffiest commander to work for, but the soldiers knew when Wellington was around, they probably were going to win, even though he was pretty strict.
Yep. Yeah. The two often go together.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you for that, Trent. Again, Trent has a new book coming out soon, probably mid 2026 or later 2026.
Early 2026, I hope, if I can get it in on time.
On Admiral King, so I recommend you check that out. And we thank you for your time, Trent. This was fantastic.